Welcome to Resume the Podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Page, and I'm here to spread the message that you can, in fact, be happy in your career. I'm a former executive recruiter turned career coach, and I am obsessed with learning about why people have chosen their career, what led them to that decision, and how they achieved happiness in the process. So, come join the ongoing conversation that exposes you to career paths of all origins with one thing in common: happiness. So, press play and let's resume the conversation with this week's episode. This week on the Resume podcast, Mandy Theis is our wonderful guest, and I'm so excited to have Mandy on because she is a full-blown artiste, an atelier-trained artist and licensed art teacher. Mandy helps people all over the world learn and teach technical drawing and painting. So after years as an art teacher, she lost her job when the pandemic hit. Oh, recession. Oh my gosh. During the recession, like many people, lost her job during the recession and ended up having to really channel that innate creative energy towards creating a new type of career for herself. So she founded the School of Atelier Arts, an accredited master's studio art degree program where artists can learn realistic drawing and painting skills. However, behind this kind of like perfectly painted canvas, Mandy had to get her hands very dirty in the foreign culture of entrepreneurship. So through grit, determination, and a lot of learning, Mandy's painting prowess has indeed translated to many things, one including marketing maven, and she has created a career that has allowed herself to follow her passion, be fulfilled, and continue her art. So, Mandy, thank you for that quick little, I was like, was it the recession or was it the pandemic?
It's hard to keep which millennial disaster we've experienced when,
I know, it's like, it's all just one big mess, right?
That is the opportunity to really define and create a career that didn't exist before.
Exactly.
So,
yeah. And, we were talking a little bit offline and I, had mentioned to you that is one of the purposes of this podcast is just that, there are so many careers out there that people don't even know exist. And it's kind of crazy just how many, especially with technology and all the things that we have now that we didn't before. Amazing way to start this off. I do like to start off every episode asking my guest if you were at a dinner party or maybe like a fancy art opening, gala opening or studio opening, and somebody came up to you and was like, Mandy, what do you do? What would your response be?
That's always a complicated answer because what I do is I'm an atelier trained artist that teaches people how to draw and paint realistically. But it's a complicated answer because most people have never heard this word atelier before, or at least not used in relation to painting and drawing. So I always end up clarifying that and say, atelier training is basically the way that artists were trained before the last century or so when modernism kind of took root. And if you think of Leonardo da Vinci, he didn't wake up one day painting the Mona Lisa. He actually trained in an atelier for 10 years in order to learn the technical drawing and painting skills that artists had learned before him in order to create that artwork. So realistic artwork isn't something that you get bopped on the head by a talent fairy and it just poof comes out. It's something that you have to train, much like a classical music conservatory, in order to really learn how to draw and paint realistically at high levels.
Okay, so take us back to, first of all, there's like so much in there that I want to talk about. Just what a lesson. Like, I did not know that about Leonardo da Vinci. I mean, I think we might have all assumed that he trained, if we have no hand in the art world, assume that. But it is like the best, most incredible, geniuses or, natural talents also train, right? And I mean, to your point, like he didn't wake up and just paint the Mona Lisa. There was a lot behind that we'll go into that.
The part of modern art was this idea that artists just suddenly had it or this innate ability. And so Pablo Picasso, also classically trained, his father attended an atelier and trained him, but he spent most of his career convincing people that he, was this naive artist that got bopped on the head by a talent fairy.
No way.
So even the people that perpetuate this myth, that is very much a part of like the modern art mystique.
Yeah. And also, I don't know why this is like coming in right now, but when I was growing up, so we're both millennials, growing up, there was, and I think with every generation, there are these like really young, like superstars. And I'm thinking of like the pop stars, and they're all like 15, when they get famous. And it's like, wow, they're like so young and they just have this natural talent. But as you get older, you kind of realize that there's a whole team around them that is creating this talent, right? And
Oh, absolutely. And an enormous amount of training. I actually, on my Department of Aesthetics blog, I have a whole blog dedicated to this myth of these, young kids,
wow.
because it's not that they don't have skills and talent. It's that they have had access to knowledge and training that most people don't. Mozart's a famous protege. His father trained every single one of his siblings until he had it down to an art form on how to train 2-year-olds in music, in classical music. So by the time Mozart was born, he benefited not just from having a father that was at a very high level in music, but a father who had tried to get all of his other children trained at younger and younger ages and then paraded him around as this, great anomaly, when in fact it was entirely access to knowledge and training that other kids did not have at the same age.
Oh my God, you just blew my mind. I did not know that. Oh my God. Okay, so what did you, when you were two, or what did you want to be as a kid? I mean, were you surrounded by artists? Like, how did that work?
My mother was a music teacher, which was in the realm of arts, and I loved art from a very young age. I had crayons in my hand all the time. My parents actually found a closet to put all my art stuff in because they were tired of it being like everywhere. But I was just like sit in this closet for hours and hours at a time. Like I loved art. I loved drawing and I wanted it so bad, but I was raised in an age and a time in art education where the primary belief was, ooh, do what you feel, be creative, express yourself. And so no matter how hard I worked and tried to draw, I wasn't actually getting better at what I wanted, which was to be able to draw and paint realistically, like the paintings I saw in
Mhm.
museums. That's what I wanted. Like I wanted those skills. But nobody in my world, even the, I'm a licensed art teacher myself. I did not learn these skills in art teacher school because the emphasis and the theory is about expressing yourself. It's not focused on teaching the technical aspects of art at all. Imagine if your music teacher handed you a trumpet and said, do what you feel like for the next 10 years, make a symphony, right? Write a
Yeah.
symphony. But they're not teaching you what's already known. Like there's fingerings on a trumpet and there's music that you can learn how to read. And there's so much that's already known technically where you could take it in and truly advance, beyond what's already known. But what's happening in art is we're pretending like, oh, we'll ruin creativity if we teach kids technique. Therefore, we're just going to let them reinvent the same concepts over and over again and not really be able to grow in our technical knowledge in the arts.
Yeah. And there's that kind of like, you have to know the rules in order to break them, right? Like you have to,
Yeah.
it kind of goes back to that. Yeah. So your mom was a music teacher. As you're kind of discovering this love of art, what was going on when you kind of went through high school and into, you said you're a licensed art teacher. Like, what did that look like? Was there a lot of support around that? Because I'm just asking this, I like to ask this to a lot of people, but I think with art, it's different. Like, I wanted to be an actor, right? And everybody was like, well, that's not realistic. Even if they're trying to be nice, they're like, okay, well, then, like, yeah, but you also have to be really lucky, and like whatever. So there was
Yeah.
hesitant support, if any. So how did that work?
Yeah, I would say there were types of support. Like my parents would send me into art camps and they knew I loved art and they signed me up for art classes. So that was very supportive. There was concern about making my living from art. And so my dad's solution to this was to encourage graphic design as a career. And my mom's solution to this was to encourage teaching as a career. And I actually ended up getting a double major in graphic design and teaching. So, but part of it was actually, it's a little bit of a happy story and a little bit of a sad story because it turns out that I absolutely adore teaching and, pedagogy itself is an art form to be honed and crafted. And I love teaching other people how to see, which is really what art training is. But, I told you I wanted to paint like this museum. I had gone on a second grade field trip to the Dayton Art Institute in Ohio and saw this painting and that settled it for me. Like, that's what I want to paint. Right. And I kept trying to do that. But by around eighth grade, ninth grade, it occurred to me that maybe I just didn't have it because I wasn't able to
Oh
achieve
my
it.
God, you're so
Right.
young.
And maybe, right. And but that's the philosophy is you either have it or you don't, which is so asinine and harmful to children. I am such a believer of ending this nonsense with this because art is a skill like reading. Like nobody's like, oh, I just don't have it. I can't read. It does take time and energy and focus to learn how to read, but anybody can learn to draw and paint at a high level of technical skills that invest the time to learning it with somebody who has it. And the problem right now is that none of my art teachers have these skills. So they weren't teaching me these skills. And then I felt like I just didn't have it. And so I felt like maybe my contribution to the art world could be that I could be a teacher of a child that had it. And that became my new focus. So I became obsessed with learning everything I could about how to teach art in the hopes that could be my contribution to the art world.
Okay.
And then, so eventually I found atelier training in my mid-20s, shortly after getting laid off from my teaching job in the 2008 recession. And it was like someone told me I could go to Hogwarts. Like there's this magical school where you can be whatever your heart has ever dreamed of. And to me, it was magic.
Have your wand,
If you just
right?
go,
The paintbrushes, your wand.
exactly. And it was the most wonderful, amazing thing to me. And it was amazing. And I finally learned these skills I've been looking for my whole life, but didn't know that they were called atelier skills or atelier training. And now, I dedicate my career and, I run a business called the School of Atelier Arts, where we help people all over the world access this knowledge. The 20th century was not friendly to realistic drawing and painting, and this knowledge almost died. It nearly went extinct. There were maybe 2 places left in the United States that had any access to this training at all by the 1980s. So it really is a barely survived set of skills.
I want to go into that. So why did it almost disappear?
Okay, I'm going to start sounding like a conspiracy theorist here, but this is true. And you can look this up. There's a book by a Columbia professor, Francis Stoner, that went through declassified documents from the CIA. And the CIA felt that realism was communist realism and that they had to fight realism as a communist measure. So that's one reason why it doesn't exist. And that's also a reason why abstract expressionism became so big at the time. The Congress of Cultural Freedom was the CIA front that paid for all the international exhibiting and everything for these abstract expressionist artists like Jackson Pollock and others. That's the crazy conspiracy theory. That's not actually a conspiracy theory. You can look up the declassified documents. But also that this training, it was passed down from artist to artist. A lot of the ateliers after World War I and World War II, the artists teaching in these schools literally died in those wars. So that was another reason that it became less accessible. And then the third reason is that because of this communist realism push, especially in America, a lot of the people that had the training went into illustration and they went into the movie industry.
Oh.
So you see a lot of the visual beauty and the training in the film industry today that has its roots in the ateliers.
That's so interesting. It makes so much sense. I mean, that is so interesting. So where were the 2 lasting ateliers in the United States?
See, I'm going to get into trouble here because every now and then I find another little pocket somewhere, right, that had 3 students in it. And they're like, where's school too? But the main one that almost everybody in my world can trace their training to is one of 2 places. So one is in Boston from this guy called Gamble, who trained with Paxton, who is the last American painter to train in Paris, really before the training crumbled. Paris was the center, Munich a little bit too, but especially Paris for Americans was where they were getting their training in the 1800s, early 1900s. So Boston with the Gamble studio was one. And then there was this guy, Pietro Annangoni, and a lady, Nerina Simi, who had a school in Florence, Italy. It was less formal, but then a bunch of Americans worked there. And eventually some of them created a school that evolved into what's now known as the Florence Academy of Art. And the Florence Academy of Art is where I am now an art professor, where I help run a master's degree program where we take art teachers. And for 3 summers, they get trained in this atelier training for 6 weeks every summer. And then after the third summer, they graduate with a master's degree with some of these skills that aren't easily accessible in the United States.
So where in the US is that? Is it, or it's online, right? You do some of it online.
You can do the first 2 summers either remote or in Jersey City, New Jersey. So we have a partnership with St. Peter's University in Jersey City. And then the third summer is terrible. You have to go to Florence.
Oh my God. Twist my arm.
Fired. You have to Florence.
That's awesome. Oh my God. So I know you said you really enjoyed teaching and you still teach, you teach artists now, you teach teachers how to teach, right? So what skills did you have, that you were like, I think I can do this? And also what resonated so deeply with you about it?
I think the most important thing for me about education is that I believe art can be taught. And that seems crazy, right? Like, do you have a math teacher who doesn't believe math can be taught? Or,
Well,
and yeah, there are
yeah.
out there. But this idea that the problem wasn't my students, the problem was me, right? So, excuse me. So if my students aren't understanding an art concept, instead of being like, oh, they just don't have it, I took this philosophy of, okay, I need to find a different way to teach this. I need to find a new way to teach this, and that's the joy and beauty of education is that you might need 10 different ways to express one concept because the student's going to learn it this way. The student's going to,
Yeah.
this technique will work for them. And that also makes you a better artist because now instead of just doing that one thing that always worked for you in your painting, now you've also thought about it 10 new ways and it broadens you as a painter. So I think that teaching at its very best is really, it's not a one-way me dictating to you. It's a two-way learning environment for both parties when it's done at the highest levels. And I think truly the joy in pedagogy for me.
Ooh, I want to kind of dive in a little bit to, you ended up losing your job during the recession. And first of all, I mean, that must have been very difficult. Yeah. I mean, can you kind of unpack that whole scenario for us? Like, how was that handled by, the school that you were teaching at? And what did you find within yourself to kind of keep going and kind of redirect your career path?
Sure. So I was teaching in Montana, and school districts in Montana tend to be quite small. And this was a K-8 district. And so they cut the entire art department in the recession, which to be fair was just me because I was the only teacher. Right.
They cut Mandy.
Yes. But it was hard not to take it personally because, I really believed that the only thing I needed to worry about was being a good art teacher. Like all I have to do is be a good art teacher and I won't have to worry about my job security, which was really naive. This was my second, third year teaching,
Right.
A really naive approach to it because, my students won all these awards, they did all these things, we went on all these field trips, all the things that you can look to and point to say, yes, this is a successful art program. But it wasn't enough. And it was completely irrelevant because the school board, there was a levy up because we fund our schools in the states locally, which by the way is completely insane, but that's a whole side political note. Like no other first world country does it that way. But
I know that's like a whole other episode.
yeah, a whole thing over there. I'm going to try not to get into it as much as I
No, you can totally.
So, the funding was cut significantly in the school and things had to go. I wasn't the only teacher let go, but, anybody that wasn't a core teacher was on the block. So that really sucked. I took it really personally because I had wrongly believed that if I had just been a good art teacher, it was hard not to see it as a critique of my teaching.
Yeah.
But also during that time is when I had discovered atelier training. And then the problem became, okay, if you want atelier training, you have to dedicate 3 or 4 years of your life full time. You have to pay tens of thousands of dollars out of pocket because until I helped accredit this program at the Florence Academy of Art, you couldn't get student loans or, there weren't accredited programs out there. So I'm like, okay, well, I just lost my job. I now have the time, but I don't have the money. Right. And I got very lucky with the way the unemployment ended up working out because they did extend the unemployment during that time, during the 2008 recession. And so I was able to somehow cobble together going back to school and collecting my unemployment for at least the first part of my training to get through. So in a way, it was a blessing. I probably would not have had access to this training without that setback.
And okay, so what was it or what is it about atelier, the technique, like the realism, the realistic aspect of it, as opposed to, abstract? Because I think, and maybe this is just me, but when you think of, maybe there was just like a push, and I don't know art history, but maybe there was like a push with, the hippie movement and all of that for kind of this like more free flowing, like express yourself kind of thing within the art world. What is it about realistic art and that technique that really spoke to you? And I'm going to tell you just like a quick little side thing. So my dad is like, he's obsessed with still lifes, and we joke about it. Like, when he doesn't have any art training either, but anytime he sees a still life, he's like, it's amazing. Like, look, the cherries look real. Like I could take them off and eat them. It's amazing. And my husband and I were like, Yeah, it is really cool, but it's so funny. Like, it's just hilarious because he has no artistic like background whatsoever. He spent like some good money on this one painting. I think when he was in, the first time he went to France, like recently, and it's hanging up in his kitchen and he got it framed. Like, he loves it. And it's just this kind of joke in the family, like, oh, dad in still lifes, like he loves it.
I love this for him so much because there's so much shame that's put on people today that, oh, if you don't like abstract art, then you must not be smart enough.
Or get
You
it.
just don't.
Yeah. If you can't get it,
Right,
like,
right. Yeah. And what if there's nothing to get? What if that's actually true? What if there is something to get about your dad's still life? I think a lot about how Thomas Kincaid, a lot of people love throwing shade at Thomas Kincaid, right? He was the most successful artist ever in all of history. He was traded on the stock market for billions of dollars in the 80s.
Wait.
Right? And
for people who don't know, who is Thomas Kincaid?
Thomas Kincaid is often called the painter of light. And I'm sure you've all seen him, even if you don't know, because he painted all these little cottages with like glowing lights in the snow or in the spring. And they had them in the mall. They had Thomas Kincaid galleries in the malls in the 90s. And you could like go get a Thomas Kincaid print that had a little bit of paint on it. And then you felt like you had a real painting.
That's cool.
If you type Thomas Kincaid, I guarantee anybody listening here has actually seen his work and just maybe didn't know the name of the artist.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
But here's the thing, like he was so successful because Americans, like that meant something to people. People wanted the warm, fuzzy feeling of, oh, I'm out in the cold and there's a warm, glowing cabin with a fire going and smoke coming out of the chimney. It gave people joy, true joy, in a way that these blank canvases and abstract art were not bringing people joy. And so, I think the same thing with Bob Ross, right? Like a lot of people love to throw shade at Bob Ross, but you know what? He believed people could learn how to paint. And the paintings that he made and he helped other people make brought them joy, brought them visual joy in their life. And like, I don't understand when visual joy became a negative, but in the modern art world, it largely eschewed as a bad thing if someone likes your painting or gets visual joy from your painting. But for me, what I've always loved was the visual joy, what your dad's experiencing with this little still life. And, the more you learn, the more joy you can get from the paintings. And, you can have a painting hanging on your wall and see something different in it every day. And it's like seeing the world through another human's eyes. Like, how often do you get to transport yourself into the mind of another person? But we look at things all day, every day, all around us. How much of it are we actually understanding? How much of it are we actually taking in? And what a still life painting of a cherry does is it's somebody else taking in that information, organizing it in a specific way and sharing it with you. It's one of the coolest things in the world to me.
Yeah. So how do you reconcile technique with creativity?
So I think that for the last 100 years or so, it's been set up as a battle. Like you either can be creative or you can have technique and they're at war with each other. And I think that's a bunch of BS because there's so much creativity within technique. And also in my experience, especially as a school teacher and helping thousands of people at this point learn art, the most creative students that I have are the ones that have the techniques at their disposal to create the artwork that's in their head and their hearts without compromise, right? Where people get upset and frustrated and feel like they're not artists is when they have an idea and they can't get it out on paper the way they would see it in their head. And they can. Anybody can get these ideas out just without compromise, with technique. So I don't see it as this war between technique and creativity. I think that's a false dichotomy that the modern art movement set up for their own purposes.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, you mentioned like nobody has ever told like, well, you just don't have it in regards to reading, right? But the more you read, the more vocabulary you have and the more words you have at your disposal to communicate. So if you were to then read like a more difficult book, you would be able to like comprehend it. Or if you're writing, you have more in your toolbox in terms of grammar and spelling and, vocabulary and concepts and how to, all of that. So that's just how I think of it, like through words is how I think of it. But yeah, that's very interesting.
Yeah. So I want to segue from that to something that I think is super important. And that is we at one point as a country felt that we didn't have to read, right? That it wasn't important. My grandma didn't read. And why do I need to read? And at some point, the world, especially America, led the way in this and these literacy rates of, okay, the world will improve if people have access to this knowledge and this understanding that reading gives them. And so there was a big push. And now today, if you can't read, it's considered something that you need help with, or, it's so important and significant to be literate in today's society. But I feel the same way about visual literacy. It used to be actually that drawing was such an important skill, such a significant way of understanding the world around us, that it was even taught at finishing schools, right? In the 1700s.
I'm
right?
thinking of all the Keira Knightley period pieces, and they're all paint. They all learn pianoforte and painting and
Yeah.
dance and all the kind of more aristocracy,
Yeah.
hobbies.
You couldn't be considered a gentleman if you didn't know how to draw. You couldn't be considered educated without knowing how to draw, in part because you need to communicate ideas visually, right? How were people going to describe what house they wanted or what garden they wanted their garden to look like if they couldn't draw, right? So architects used to have to be draftspeople first, and then they became architects. Gardeners, garden design people were draftspeople first and then became gardeners. It was such an essential skill, much how we see reading today. Do you know that somebody that can see more colors than you can teach you to see colors you have never seen before?
No, but please explain that. Wait, how does someone? Well, okay, explain that a little bit in more depth.
Okay, so it's not that there's a new magic color called Waidatsa or whatever, it's that there's more nuance in between colors that you have to train your eye to be able to see and understand. And they're all around us. And if you work with somebody that can see more colors than you, they can start pointing things out to you to help you see it better. So, for example, there's a wall behind me, and I know your listeners can't see this wall, but a lot of people would say this wall is gray, right? That's the word that we describe it as, and we say it's gray. But as an atelier trained artist, I would say this is actually a green. It's light in value, so if you think of dark, like black and white, and the value is a little bit closer to the light side than it is the dark side. And it's neutralized, meaning that it's not a really intense green. It's not like grass green, right? It's a really neutralized green so that it's like a gray that looks just a little bit green, right? But once you know that, you can't unsee it, right? You're going to see that color more specifically than you were able to do before. Sometimes it's just about learning the vocabulary. Every color has a value, how light and dark it is, a chroma, how intense it is, and a hue, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, right? And if you can identify correctly those three elements of the colors, in fact, I'm going really in the weeds here, but I have a free color class on the School of Atelier Arts.com. Right. It's on the front page. And if you want to see more colors than you can see right now, you can spend an hour with me in this class and it will teach you how to see more colors than you can right now.
Yeah. And I'm just, that's so funny because I love how you pointed at the wall, because I immediately went to when you're painting a wall in your house with your partner. And I don't know, this is this is not a whack on men, but it's oh my God, are we looking at the same color? And it's so interesting, especially those kind of lighter colors, there's this blue color that my parents put up in their house. They painted their whole house. It was a small house, so they used a light color. And my stepmom, who has, she's very artistic and loves art, and she does a lot of art, and she sees it in green and blue, and she sees all of this this spectrum of all the aqua, whatever. And other people are it's barely blue. And it's that it's almost white, it's basically white and then that's it. So are there people who are kind of more naturally able to see, different colors and nuance in colors?
So yes and no. So first of all, anybody, no matter what your restrictions are, can learn to see more color than they can right now, with the exception of completely colorblind people, which we'll see in values. But you can still learn to see values in greater nuance than you see values right now, even if you're completely colorblind.
Wow.
Now, all right, we're going into some science here, folks. You have cones in your eyes for receiving color. And most people have 3 cones in their eye for receiving color. Frequently, men will only have 2 cones for receiving color. And occasionally, women will have 4 cones for receiving color. So there is a physical, biological difference of markers on the X and Y chromosomes that manifest themselves into what we exist as today. Now, if you are slightly red-green colorblind, if you have the 2 cones instead of the 3, you have an advantage in that you're not distracted by as many hues. If you're not seeing reds and greens, it helps you see value better, which is an advantage for seeing movement.
Oh,
Because that's how animals stalk their prey. That's why dogs are colorblind, right? Because it helps them see movement. Fish have like a bajillion cones in their eyes, and because color is really important in their world, right? But there is. So if you're a woman, it's possible genetically for you to have 4 cones for receiving color. If your father was red green colorblind and your mother was also what's called a tetrachromat, if you have 4 cones, there's only one known true tetrachromat in the world right now. And I say that because they had a hard time coming up with a test. Like, how do you decide
hmm.
if someone can see more colors than you or not? You just take their word for it.
Yeah, it's like
Like, how do you
kind of subjective at some point, right? Or
Right. So,
seemingly.
yes. So they came up with this test where they had a beam of light and they had the person bend the light to make a certain color, right? And then they'd reset the light and they could measure what that person did to the light mathematically. And they'd reset it and they'd ask the person to match the color, right? And the closer to an exact match they could get, the more likely that they could see the color accurately. And that's how they tested for this. So we know that there are more than just this one woman that is a tetrachromat, but we've only tested one tetrachromat. But we also discovered that someone that can see more colors than you, because other women had a 4th cone, but it wasn't fully functioning. A person that could see more colors could help those people increase the functionality of their 4th cone.
Okay.
So it's crazy.
Yeah.
Like, you can learn to see more colors, and anybody can learn to see more colors.
Wow. That's so cool. I had who knows? How did you know? Like, who knows that? But you do.
Radio Lab did a great podcast on it. I
Who?
encourage. Radio Lab did
Oh,
one
okay.
on tetrachrome. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I had never heard of that, but that makes so much sense. Okay. Like, this is like a
Totally
complete,
the
like,
weeds here.
totally left turning. I do want to just touch on, like, really, this is such a left turn, but like entrepreneurship. Like,
Sure, yeah.
so you're clearly, I mean, so invested and so educated within the art world and within your technique and how to teach teachers. When you did, get the chopping block at your school, and you went into this atelier training, how did you conceive this idea for creating an accredited master's program? And can you kind of
Yeah.
take us through that thought process a bit?
I knew I was going to make my living from atelier training. I didn't know how, but I would encourage anybody. The first step is deciding that you're going to do it, even if you know nothing. I knew nothing about marketing. I no marketing background. I knew nothing about running a school or administrating a school. I knew nothing, but I didn't know that I was going to make my living by sharing atelier skills with the world. So step 1, decide you're going to do it no matter what, whether that's acting or whatever it is, just decide and make it a non-negotiable in your life. And once I did that, so one of the first projects I started working on is I helped co-found this nonprofit organization called the Da Vinci Initiative, where I was working with other people in the atelier world. So it was part of an existing foundation that heard about what I was doing with art teachers. And they were like, oh, okay. So they hired me on for a period of time. So I was able to do that work for a number of years. And then from there, I decided that I wanted to start my own organization. So I started the School of Atelier Arts. And I, from there, realized that if I was going to be successful as an independent organization, that I really needed to learn marketing skills. And luckily, there's so much great information online. And some people are like, oh, why am I getting spammed by this person or that person? But I found that paying money for highly qualified people with a lot of marketing experience has helped me more than anything else. And at least for me, I found that those investments to be worth it. Growing my mailing list has been huge. I sell lesson plans that help, people learn atelier skills on my website. That was my first real success with my marketing and, like finding a product that had a high need. My community was always like, Mandy, we need more lesson plans. We need more lesson plans. And then, creating, this digital product and then, learning, getting over that hump of, oh, am I allowed to sell things to my list? And I'm like, well, do you want to make a living or do you want to go back to waitressing?
Right. Yeah. Well, and so I'm glad you brought that up because I think a lot of people who consider themselves artists have a little bit of like this kind of internal naysayer that you can't make it's dirty to make money off of your art, or like, profit off your passion is like bad, because
I
it's selling out or whatever. So, yeah.
I definitely used to really buy into that. And then I started researching the artists throughout history, not just contemporary artists, that were really successful. And guess what? They all knew how to do that the other artists didn't. Like, why did Vermeer die in obscurity while Rembrandt was relatively well known and, except the last few years of his life, had a, very successful career? He was really good at marketing. You can read his notes and letters, about who he was talking to and how he was promoting himself. And just because it was hidden from us doesn't mean it didn't exist. In the contemporary art world, Damien Hirst is a very famous contemporary artist, brilliant marketer. He named one of his art pieces "The Fear of Death in the Mind of Someone Living," and it was literally like a shark that he stuffed, right? Name was so good. Like, that was what he once kidnapped Charles Saatchi and made him show up at his exhibition, right? Charles Saatchi was a major art collector in the world. And by the way, Charles Saatchi controls a lot of what is considered good in high-end marketing or in high-end art. And guess what he does for a living? He's a marketer, right? He's an advertiser.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So,
Well, advertising is, a lot of people who, I feel like advertising is one of the first things that a lot of artists will think of as like, well, I could go into advertising because that at least you make money and it's creative,
mhm. Andrew Warhol started it off in illustration advertising, right? And gee, I wonder how he became so good at marketing himself and,
Yeah.
establishing himself as famous.
There's like so much there. One thing that I really liked that I think would be so helpful for anybody to do, regardless of what your industry is, if you're interested in entrepreneurship, or even now, everybody's talking about like you have to have a personal brand, like even if you're whatever. But what you did was look at the people within, the greats within your industry, right? And see how did
Mhm,
they become successful? Like who, and
mhm.
why? Why did they become
Right.
successful? And I would never think to go look back at like Rembrandt for marketing advice.
Mhm,
Like who would think that, But that's so interesting that you were like, okay, obviously like this is what I know, this is what I want to do, but I also live in the
mhm,
real world and I need to make money. How did they do this
mhm,
in the past? Because people have done
mhm.
it. And it's kind of that whole idea of, almost like manifestation, where it's like if it existed and it has existed and does currently exist, that means that it can exist for me as well, right? And it's kind of
Right.
just knowing that and then figuring it like, okay, well, they did it that way. Like, why not me?
Right.
And you really like took that and ran with it.
Yeah. I mean, there's basically two ways historically that famous artists made their living. One is that they were independently wealthy. That was common. Or married independent wealth.
Sure.
Right. Two was, yeah, they had to market and they had to connect with those independently wealthy people and, convince them that they were the next deal. I do want to say, though, that they were all also very talented and worked very hard. Nobody makes it in the art world without hard work at their craft.
Yeah.
But it's not enough. And I think a lot of artists that I meet, they're like, oh, so and so has 200,000 Instagram followers and they're not as good as me. I'm like, well, guess what they're doing to get like, they understand marketing. They understand what to post and how often to post and, are often advertising, for follows and things like that. So, but I think it's a way for a lot of people to just be like, it's not my fault that I'm not famous, right? Or it's not my fault that I'm not making my living because it's arbitrary, it's luck, you have to be independently wealthy, and none of that is true. You do have to have understanding of marketing, and you do need to be willing to sell because you can't make a living, living off of your art if you're not willing to sell.
Yeah. And also, just to kind of piggyback off of that, the more money you make, the more you can share your art, right? And share what you're doing and your message and mission.
Well, there's a reason that I used to run a nonprofit, and when I chose to start my own organization, I chose not to make it a nonprofit because I didn't want to be tied down by these ideas that I can't make a living or I have to make a very, barely scrape by living. I wanted to make a living that was comparable to the career I was giving up in education if I, was going to focus on atelier training. So I had that goal set out in my mind, and I felt that running a nonprofit was hampering me from being able to pay myself my true worth and to have a comparable career that I would in the traditional public education sphere.
Yeah. And what has been the hardest part about entrepreneurship?
Selling is still hard. Like, just because I do it doesn't, every time I send an email, like sharing a new product that we have, or, we just started, I now teach online. So for years, people have been like, Mandy, you teach online. And I'm like, I just don't feel like I can do it online. But then, of course, with the pandemic and everything else, my students that I started teaching online in the pandemic were so successful. And I think it was partly because they could hear the critiques of the other students, and they were learning like 10 times as much within one critique period than if I was just going around one to one, with them where they weren't engaged. This online class has been wonderful. It's been one of the best things I've ever done. And my students are like, wow, I can't believe it's only $500 a month to like get this training. I'm like, well, it won't be forever, but like it is now. I just want to provide access in a way that I couldn't, in other career paths. I want a visually literate world. I want anybody, if they identify, I get a lot of doctors, like a lot of doctors that wanted to be artists, but felt like they needed financially secure career or whatever. This online class is a way for anybody, even if they gave up. Like, I'd given up at one point in my life being like, oh, I don't have it. Like, anybody can learn it that wants it. And if your heart is like beating a little faster right now because you always wanted to draw and paint, realistically, like, it's there for you. You can do it.
Yeah. What was the easiest part about all of this whole journey?
Getting to actually teach. Like, every time I have my critiques with my online class, I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Because it's like you're saving something from near extinction. You're helping people create and seeing that joy it brings to their lives. You're learning better and more as a teacher by seeing your students' mistakes or helping them solve problems that you never had, or, it's just such a joyful, it's the best thing I do.
Yeah.
And I'm so grateful that I've been able to craft a life where I get to do it.
Yeah. And so how often do you still just paint for you?
Right now, not as much. I mean, I still paint a lot as demos and classes, but I also told myself, and this was part of my deal with myself, is that, okay, I'm focusing on building my business right now. And there's been a big learning curve. Like, I'm in classes almost all day, every day, and marketing and, creating products and, teaching and things like that. So I gave myself 2 years to focus on my learning curve. And then I'm going to take that time back for my personal painting once
I love that.
my business is settled.
Yeah, and I asked that because I think a lot of whether it's art teacher or, any kind of a teaching, you end up kind of, and it's kind of weird, but you kind of end up like leaving behind the actual, practice of it because you're
Sometimes.
right.
Yes.
Because mainly it might just be because of time restraints. So that's why I asked, because it's something that I remember it coming up in my yoga teacher training where it was like, once you start
Mhm.
teaching, you have to remember to also keep your practice up because that's where you're
Yes.
going to be able to like give from. And it's
Mhm.
very common to let that go because you're just teaching, you're
Mhm.
teaching, teaching. So that's why I asked that. So what is like the biggest misconception that you have had throughout your life about being an artist or a teacher or both?
That you can't make your living from your art. You can. I focus on the education aspects of art, but I have many friends in the atelier that make their, instead of marketing their teaching programs, they're marketing their paintings directly, and they're selling and making their living quite well from, again, they're still doing the marketing work. It's just they're focusing on selling their drawings and paintings. I'm focused on trying to save this training from obscurity and share atelier training with the world. But it's a total lie, especially today. Like, the world is so accessible and out there. And there are people, whatever your skill is, there are people that need you, that want you. And it's a shame to deprive them by not putting yourself out there. You have these skills that other people are desperately needing and want to give you money for, and you're depriving them of the opportunity to do that, and putting that knowledge out there in the world and depriving people who really need that knowledge from you.
Yeah, and something you said there, I think it's really easy if you're good at something, like if you have spent a lot of time cultivating the skill and let's say you do have like a natural inclination towards something that you're really good at, I think sometimes it's hard for people to remember that the person next to you, like that's a struggle for them, right? And they don't have that skill. And what you can give them, what you can offer in teaching them that skill is so needed and vice versa. Like for example, like math isn't my thing, or like spreadsheets, right? But that's such a integral skill in our life that And, if you're good at something, I think it's just really important to remember that the person sitting next to you might really be not good at that. And your expertise will be essential to their success. And also understanding that you are an expert in that and owning that and realizing it and using it for good and spreading it. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I put that color class on my homepage for free for a reason because I'm like, you know what? Anybody who goes through here, the rest of their life, they're going to see more colors, right?
Oh,
Like, what a gift to give the world.
I love that. Oh my God. That's like so beautiful. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I'm going to sign my husband up for it because in me.
God would like it.
Yeah, my dad. It's funny. My uncle was colorblind. So he
Mhm.
was like, I think he was red green colorblind. And this is like way back in the 80s. He wanted to do something nice for my aunt and ended up going to the store, buying some paint. They needed to paint this wall or this room in the house. And he painted the whole room. And she came in and it was like neon orange. And she was like, Steve, what? And yes. And he was like, what are you talking about? It's gray. And I'm like, how? That's so crazy. So I wonder, he has passed, but I wonder if he would have been able to be
Yeah.
a little bit.
Sometimes it's just about understanding, with the red green colorblind, it's about teaching people how to recognize what they're not seeing to some extent. But, there are limitations with colorblindness. I can't make a colorblind person that's red green colorblind see reds and greens, but I can help them expand the range of what they do see.
Yeah. Is it just a gene that they're born with that without a gene or they're, like they just don't have that?
I'm not a biologist, but my understanding from being in the color world is that there's a marker for cones, and it's when they only have 2 cones in their eyes that
That's
creates
color.
the red green.
Okay. All right. Interesting.
So most people have 3 cones in their eyes, but the cones function at various rates. So there's like a subtle way to be red green colorblind where and also there's people with 4 cones of color. That 4th cone isn't fully functioning, so they're not a true tetrachromat, even though they have 4 cones.
That's so interesting. I want to listen to that episode that you were talking about.
Yeah, the Radio Lab podcast does a really great job of explaining it.
That's so cool. Okay, so what is next for you, Mandy?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. So, it's interesting. I'm currently on this kind of podcast tour. I got invited to one podcast and my mailing list, we have like 20,000 art teachers and art enthusiasts on this mailing list.
That's
and they
amazing.
love the podcast. Yeah. So now I'm like, okay, give the people what they want. So right now I'm interested in engaging in podcasts and I'm putting together my first book.
Oh, what does the book revolve around?
So the premise of the book is basically 10 simple ways to help people see more than they can right now. So we talked about color, but there's also, you can see more shapes. You can see better proportions. There's a lot of art concepts that it's a book for everyday people, not people that are like art obsessed, but like, how does your eye see now? And what joy could you get out of the world with training your eye to see a little better than you can right now?
Ooh, I love that. Okay, so we'll keep an eye out for that. I have like 3 really quick, kind of just like rapid fire questions for
Yes,
you.
go for it.
Okay, what is the best career advice you've ever received, if any?
I mean, I've received a lot of bad career advice.
Okay,
like,
what's the worst career advice?
Go be an art teacher. So I obviously can follow that advice because I'm like the artiest of art teachers now. I train art teachers.
I know, it's very meta.
If I had found atelier training sooner, I wish that I had just done the thing instead of trying to do a workaround like, oh, well, this is close enough or do the adjacent things. If you know what your purpose is, do your purpose. That would be.
I love that. That actually reminds me, I remember reading something like way back when I was like, I'm going to be an actor and reading something. Oh man, I wish I remember where I read this, but it was basically that a lot of actors end up thinking like, well, I can't do that. So I'll be a casting director or I'll do something tangential like to the world and feeling really like bitter about it, because they're working with all the people doing, the thing that they wanted to do, but they purposely took themselves out of it. And when they just like live their life in bitterness.
Yeah.
So I love that. It's like, if you know, and a lot of people don't know. So if you know, that's such a gift, right? And something else you said that I wanted to just underscore is actually something that Oprah says. So you're very wise. You're very wise. Just this idea of like, once you know, a lot of people don't know what they want to do, right? So once you know what you want to do, go after that. So like you knew that you wanted to do this atelier training and teach, right? And not do not do a nonprofit. Like you had a very clear idea and endpoint kind of or goal. And her whole thing is that like once you know what you want to do, because a lot of people don't know what they want to do, everything.
Mhm.
And if you make every decision towards that, things will really start to click into place kind of, which it
Mhm.
seems like you're like
Absolutely.
just an embodiment of that, which is awesome. Okay. What is the best advice to budding artists? Your best advice?
Get atelier maybe. Like it unless you want to be an abstract expressionist painter, like, you can use the skills or not use the skills, but at least you'll have them and you won't be painting out of ignorance. Get atelier training.
Okay. And what is your current favorite daily practice?
Currently, journaling. I just started. I mean, I don't know if I can call it a daily practice because I'm only 1 week in,
That's
but
okay.
writing, I talk all the time about, oh, look at all the joys people are missing out in the visual world because they, can't see color in a more nuanced way or can't see shape in a more nuanced way. But then I realized like I was not recording all my joys, right? So basically started a visual joy journal where I'm like writing down every time I see like just the glint of light on the edge of a leaf, and where the highlight extends beyond the, parameter of the leaf. I'm like, that's a visual joy. So I've been keeping a visual joy journal.
I love that. I love that you're calling it a visual joy journal. That's awesome.
Have a name for it till you just asked me just now.
I won't say that. Who knew? You should sell one on your website, right? Visual.
There you go. That might be my next product.
That's awesome. Mandy, thank you so much. This was such an awesome, I could talk to you for way longer, but everybody, we're going to include all of the links and everything in the show notes for Mandy. And if you have any, even, just an inkling of like, can I be an artist? Go check out her website. It's so cool. And I mean, yeah, just do it. Like you will be so happy. So thank you so much, Mandy.
Thank you so much, Courtney. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's episode. I'm so grateful for your precious time and energy. And if anything resonated with you, please feel free to share with a friend and subscribe. If you're interested in career coaching, I would love to hear from you. Email me at Courtney@resume-careers.com and follow me on Instagram at Courtney Austin Page. Thank you so much and see you next week.